Hi, and welcome to the 72nd episode of the Machine Ethics Podcast. This time we're talking with Mitchel Ondili. Our chat was recorded on the 22nd of November 2022. We talk about algorithm awareness, technology colonisation in the global south, etiques and OASI, the Register for Algorithms with Social Impact, AI auditing, private versus public rights to consent, subjecting your algorithms to the OASI register, various algorithms including hiring and social services algorithms, the possible over-datafication of life or becoming an algorithmic subject, and also the intentionality of these services. You can find more episodes at machine-ethics.net, or you can contact us at hello@machine-ethics.net. You can follow us on Twitter, machine_ethics, Instagram, Machine Ethics Podcast, and if you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/machine ethics. Quick apology ahead of this episode. I feel like I was a bit rambly this time, so apologies there. Do bear with me, it's a great episode with Mitchel, and hope you enjoy. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast. If you could please introduce yourself, who you are, and what do you do?
My name is Mitchel Ondili. I am a researcher at etiques, which is a company that does a lot of work around algorithm audits, and my work focuses on promoting algorithm observatories and essentially just creating greater awareness and impact around the effect of algorithms.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. The first question we always ask on the podcast is, what is AI? You know, you talk about algorithms. What are we talking about here? What do you mean?
Okay. I think the problem is that because of how ubiquitous it's become as a word, AI currently means everything and nothing. The AI Act, I think, gets it right when it refers to it as a family of technologies. And I think the idea is that, you know, it's just a superset of machine learning that performs certain functions that are recognized somewhat as intelligent functions, even though I think that's a bit of a misnomer. But yeah, I think that's kind of the easiest way. It's a set of processes that leads to outputs that we currently quantify as intelligent.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess if we dig down, we're talking about intelligent kind of behavior, or like things that we're asking it to do, and it just kind of does it, and we don't necessarily know the in-between bit, right?
Right.
So I would love to hear about kind of your journey and how you got into this area. And I know that you were from kind of more of a law background. So what is it about algorithms and AI and the use of these algorithms that kind of gravitated you into this area?
I think so. When I was doing my undergrad, I think one of the things that I really picked up on was that I loved the idea of learning about. In general, we did ICT law, and it was really broad and vague. And so, coming out of that, I had a practice attachment at a center that was focused on intellectual property and information technology law. And then I think my horizon just sort of exploded after that. And I am based in Nairobi, and I'm born, bred, and buttered, as my English teacher used to say. But I think one thing that kind of became very clear along the way is that because of living in what's called the global south, there's a lot of borrowing, there's a lot of replication, there's a lot of we get a lot of the technology either told to us or given to us in terms of what we need to do with it. And I'm interested and want to develop kind of a story that is just unique to the continent, unique to the country. And that's sort of where I really kind of developed my personal interest in it. And from there, when I found etiques, it just became a huge learning hub for me. The idea for me is really to understand how some of these policies get made, how the laws get made, and to be able to get to a place where we are, as a continent, the originator of so many of these technologies and ideas.
I find it. I mean, it's fascinating what you're saying about the kind of the use of technology or the kind of imposition of the technology in the global south from your point of view, that you just kind of get these things and
Yeah.
you're not co-creating them essentially. Is
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a genuine intrusion. I remember during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there was testimony that was given to the effect that one of these sort of testing hubs for whether or not they could create a certain amount of manipulation in elections was based off of one of the elections that we had. And the fact that it was, almost seen as a laboratory setting for something that would then be refined and exported, I think is the narrative of a lot of what goes on here with technology in the field of digital identity. There's a lot of companies that are, kind of landing here. There's a lot of datafication, and we are not necessarily controlling the story, I think, as much as we should want to. And you can see it really in a lot of policies. You can see it in the kind of intrusion of a lot of these big tech companies that are now trying to gain a foothold, because it's a huge continent, and it's a
yeah,
huge source of data.
yeah, definitely. So what was it about etiques and what they're doing? I'm I think they are international, so they're based in Spain, but they have people all over the place, which are
Yeah,
interested in this area. Is that right?
yeah, yeah.
What is the current endeavor of etiques that you're involved with?
So currently, what I work on is it's OASI. OASI is the Observatory of Algorithms with Social Impact, and it's a register slash database that we collect algorithms that are being used all over the world in public and private contexts, and we try to shed a light on what is going on, where did they come from, when did they begin testing, and what's the effect. Because for us, social impact is, well, currently it's very harmful and negative in the realm of algorithms. You think about discrimination, you think about disrupting democratic processes, you think about disrupting privacy. So we try to find these algorithms and we try to present them in a way that is accessible. And we also call for these registries to actually be something that governments think about when they talk about open data and transparency.
Mm-mm. So I quite like the idea that you have this registry, and as someone who might be making one of these machine learning services, algorithms,
Mhm.
AI products, that you might be able to just kind of tell you or tell some entity that
Mhm.
information about it. Like it doesn't have to be your, let's say,
Right.
the secret source, but
Right.
you've got this thing. It's being used in this purpose. We are the people to contact about it. What kind of other information are you kind of looking to take and to make public?
So we want to make public, I think, especially the effect of having any kind of algorithm that has a social impact that is being developed and used without public participation. So in a lot of situations, we think about social services, risk assessments. You think about credit scoring. There's these devices and there are these processes that are being used where people, one, they don't know, and two, they're not involved in a process of co-creation. They're not involved in the sense of informed consent. And to bring light to that, and to bring light, I think, to the failings of any kind of, whether it's a government, whether it's a municipality, to alert and make its citizens aware, has real consequences on how people are able to live their lives. And ultimately, the idea is to create a lot of transparency and a lot of accountability that there isn't right now.
So, if I'm going to be playing devil's advocate, right, I would say maybe my algorithm is not perfect, but I can
Mhm.
process thousands of insurance claims or
Mhm.
other claims or kind of monetary claims or something like that instead of
Mhm.
tens a day or something like that. You
Right.
you're really hoping there's a real practical use case, because
Yeah.
otherwise, why bother? Why spend the time and money?
Right.
So that they're not doing it presumably out of malice necessarily. So
Right.
um,
Right.
I'm obviously with you on this one, right? But I'm playing,
Yeah.
So what are you saying to those sorts of arguments?
I think for one, there's a bit of a tendency to assume that any process which has been made faster and in quotes more efficient is either better than what existed before it, or more objective than what existed before it. And what that does is it takes away accountability from individuals and it takes away accountability from institutions. But then secondly, it also continues to have this sort of notion that it is actually better and objective. So if you think of something like Robodebt. So Robodebt was an algorithm that was deployed in Australia, and the idea of it was that it was going to process claims for social security benefits much faster in much bigger amounts, and was supposed to catch all of the benefits that were extra. So if you had, for example, a income that you hadn't reported, the idea was that it was going to be able to have an estimated income and then average that against the benefits that you were receiving and see if you were receiving benefits over that. And you would then be issued with basically you'd be told to repay a certain debt that you owe to the government. And the problem with this is that the actual computation of this number that you supposedly owed was completely flawed. So if, for example, you are a graphic designer and you earn money as per the projects that come in,
Yeah.
and so there'll be months of the year where you might be unemployed. There'll be months of the year where, for one reason or another, I mean, we talk about illness, any reason where you just might not be able to have a solid amount of income. So the system took an estimated fortnightly average of what your earnings would be and said that based off of that estimation, you should receive X amount of benefits. So it didn't calculate for the fact that you can receive income intermittently. It didn't calculate for the fact that there can be one reason or another why the income flow is disrupted. And so hundreds of thousands of people were issued with these debt repayment notices. And in the meantime, their benefits were cut off. So what ended up happening is that there are people who paid back or tried to pay back whatever that they could, and it ended up being that the government had to acknowledge, one, that this was a completely flawed system, but two, that so many people in the meantime had been so deeply harmed. And the intention was not to harm people. The intention was to make more efficient a process. And the intention was to make process these claims faster. But the concern here is that the best intentions without an actual pre-approval. So you can have, for example, prior to implementing an algorithm, an actual solid audit process. You can have it during and after, and that can help you know whether or not this is useful, because ultimately these are real people that you're impacting. And so I think sometimes it can be very flippant to think that volume is a correlation to efficiency or accuracy.
Yeah, and I think I've actually heard similar stories in other countries with similar kind of distribution of benefits payments actually. So
Yeah.
there must be a real tendency
Yeah.
towards you using these tools for that sort of purpose, I guess.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, what in your mind is the valid alternative to that situation, or like some? I mean, there's a myriad of things that you could do there. One is obviously just carry on with whatever process is there originally. Do you think that they are just wrong for adding this technology, or is it just the way that they're adding this technology and there are other options there?
I don't think the technology itself is wrong. I think sometimes for one, the assumptions that are being made about the technology's capability, I think, are often incorrect.
Right.
And secondly, their usage tends to say quite a bit about priority, about who gets subject to a certain kind of data process or datafication, and who doesn't, and who that benefits. If you think about credit scoring, if the idea is that proxy data is going to be used to determine whether or not you're able to repay your loan, well, then you're going to be discriminated against based off of the area that you live, the people who live around you, and whether or not they've paid their debts. So the idea here is that the actual intention of some of these processes are not well, I think societally they show a skew toward an aggressive stance of either criminalizing or locking people within a certain context. So, for example, you are only somebody who is able to do XYZ in the context of this data that we have. And ideally, I think in a situation where you continue to have like a consistent mediated process where you it's the human in the loop approach, where you have accountability, and that's accountability one on the basis of informed consent, but two also on the basis of setting liability standards in terms of regulation, being able to not just opt in and opt out, but also being subject to an actual legal process if you fail, when you fail. And some of these things I think can clear up a lot of the murkiness that's around it. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors around the utilization of these algorithms, and there's a lot of problems with how this data is being shared between entities, by governments and third parties. And if the bedrock of this usage is supposed to be informed consent, then the idea is that the liability should apply there as well. And I think that putting it in a restricted context with and fencing it around a lot of regulatory standards would really improve, it would improve usage, utilization, and I think it would also start including the people it affects.
I think it's really interesting what you said there, because in certain contexts you have the liability changes, right? So in
Yeah.
the governmental context, you have your citizenship, and you're beholden to hopefully the democratic process and the laws that we have in place, whereas you have a different set of priorities and laws
Right.
for private entities, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm almost disagreeing with you. Apologize, but I think the consent.
Sorry.
I think the consent thing for me is more of a private entity issue, and it's weird because when you're working with public entities and governments, you're just like, well, the consent thing is murky, right? Because
Right. Yeah.
it's less about consent because you're doing what is best for your citizenship essentially,
Right.
and
Right.
I mean, if you're really nice, you can
Right.
confirm consent, right? But
Right.
it's not like a necessary thing like it is with private entities. So I feel like it almost boils down to again, like you're saying about priorities, and the priorities of the government being the well-being of their citizens, and not
Yeah.
not like
Yes.
undue stress and
Yeah.
financial burden and all these sorts of things that it sounds like what that previous example was incurring on them, and yeah, like less process, less recourse. I guess if you're just
Yeah.
not telling them like the process, then there's like this there's lack of transparency, which is actually
Right.
probably the biggest issue, because you're like,
Right.
well, why am I being sent this letter? Why do I owe money? I don't owe money
Right.
to, it's just like, and now I have to sort this out, and I have to spend time in my life sorting this out when, I've got 4 kids or something. I don't know, some
Yeah.
sort of mad situation, yeah. So you're producing these new situations when you're trying to, almost like you were saying, you're not doing it in malice. You're trying to,
Right.
improve the situation, and you've got to the wrong place essentially.
Yeah. I do think that on the idea of with public utilization and consent, I think part of the problem is also that the data that is for example, if you are trying to get unemployment benefits, you have to upload your information to a certain portal. You have to subject yourself to the process.
Yeah.
But if, for example, the tool that's being used is a tool that's being developed by a third party, a private entity, and and then the thing is, if you don't know it's being used, I think a big part of this is just the idea that there's a lot of governments, I think it's up to 77 now, that have committed to some sort of open data policy. But if you have no idea that you are part of a process, then you have no idea where to go when it goes wrong. Or, a similar thing, I think there's an algorithm that's called Noxcare, and Noxcare is used to try and identify people who are at risk of opioid abuse or overdose. Essentially, the primary algorithm itself relies on the prescription monitoring data this is in the U.S. And that data is collected on the basis of physician prescriptions and pharmaceutical dispensation. So this is medical data that is being shared, and Noxcare is developed by a private company. And so this is medical information that is being collected. The PMDD, which is the prescription monitoring database, is is something that is collected by states. It's a state function. But then this data is shared with Noxcare, which gives a risk score. So if you go to a physician, you suffer from some sort of chronic pain, and they can refuse to give you the medication on the basis of that score. But people don't know that they're subject to this. And I think sometimes that's where you also have to take a lot of public entities to task. So I understand what you're saying, and I think it really is more about the open, transparent, accountable.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess in that case you also get this autonomy, like there's a stripping of your civil autonomy to get that drug, or
Right.
you're taking something back from someone because of some data that they didn't know that they've submitted.
Yeah.
So it's both that transparency, but also like how much autonomy are we expecting to have in the future if it's not
Right.
just the drugs, it's like everything. you
Right.
know um there's this idea of a nanny state or a nanny culture.
Right. Right.
But it's more totalitarian. I can't say the word, but it's like an evil nanny state at that point, because you can't
Right.
you can't move within it in some sort of clear way. So, looking on the OAS, how can people get involved with etiquettes and the OASI process? And is that something that we're encouraging people to?
Yeah, definitely. We do have on the OASI site a little area where you can submit algorithms for consideration. And I think the good thing also about Etiquette and about OASI specifically is that it acts as a repository. So this is a knowledge library, it's a source, and it helps people kind of connect the dots on, for example, if you're worried about a situation with social welfare, with these welfare fraud algorithms, you can kind of see what has worked or what has happened. We talk about any case law, we talk about any jurisprudence relating to that particular algorithm. So we encourage people to submit information about algorithms that they are either worried about, that they've been subjected to, or that they know about. And we are able to put them on the repository, but we are also able to look into it a little bit deeper. So besides the registry itself, we do kind of separate individual kind of deep dives onto a particular set of algorithms or what particular issue around algorithms is being focused on. And since we have a pretty decent extensive database of supporters and of organizations that we work with, then we can also pass this information along, start an independent inquiry, and that helps us continue to create this accountable life cycle.
Um, and is there another? I mean, we've talked a little bit about some of those examples of things that might go in there. Is there another like really potent example that we haven't yet talked about that you can describe for us?
Okay, the like 10 of them immediately came into my mind. Well, first, I think one of the biggest things that we need to start worrying about and is in the field of labor and employment, and in particular, in hiring algorithms. So recently, there's kind of been this drive or this push to have through the hiring process. If, for example, you are being told answer a certain number of questions, and then you submit a video recording. So there are algorithms. There's Procera, which is being deployed in Germany, but then there is also HireVue. And what they do is that you upload your 30-minute, 10-minute clip of you talking. And these are private companies that liaise with your potential employer. And the employer sets a certain standard of, well, I want my employee to be like XYZ. And those metrics are then translated into one, a psychological profile, but then two, a profile of presentation. So, well, based off of your response to a certain set of questions, it picks up your speech pattern, your language choice, the accent variation. It picks up how loudly you project, the complexity of the words that you're using. And on the basis of that, it also says, well, in the case of Procera specifically, it says that it has a psychological aspect to it where it can create a personality profile. This is really dangerous for a reason that I think is not usually highlighted when we talk about algorithm effect. There's a lot of disability discrimination in algorithms that require and include a certain kind of language or facial recognition based aspect. And when you talk about hiring algorithms, if your language choice, if your speech pattern is being used to determine whether or not you are hireable, there are so many people who will either have speech impediments, who will not present as the algorithm is encoded to recognize as a good candidate. And that automatically locks out this huge segment of people who are already being discriminated against in a hiring context. And I think the dangers of this really compound when you think about the fact that it's under the sheen of objectivity and under the sheen of, well, the employer says this is what they want. And one of the things that we to be able to account for and take to task is whether or not we are contributing to a much greater marginalization of people in this ecosystem, because the harms that are being caused on the visible aspect, and a lot of the cases that get attention are related to gender bias and racial bias. But there's also a lot of smaller communities and groups which are subject to these processes with and without their knowledge, and also completely helpless against them. So I think that in the case of labor management, even in the sense of the way that currently there's a lot of tracking and there's a lot of workplace facial recognition that's needed, what that does essentially is you take what you think and what you have determined to be acceptable. You say that this is some sort of objective measure of accuracy or fairness, and then you apply that to everyone. And it really does lock out a very important subset of the population that needs to be able to get work, that needs to be included. And they're not included really in the development, the deployment, and the use of these algorithms. So I think that's a bit of an underrated one.
I think that's a really good point. I think it touches on quite a lot of issues as well, like the implementation of these algorithms in a certain place. There's
Right.
discrimination of a large group of people. And for me, I feel like it's never been super necessary that there's
Right.
that even happens in a place. I think if I was like looking from a technical point of view at that situation, if you wanted to, obviously it's not going to be objective in the way that we imagine it could be, but
Right.
if you're dialing up that, like, oh, is this person, do they have some sort of disablement in some way, or some sort of I mean, everybody, I feel like in the last couple of years have been affected in different ways mentally by global
Right.
happenings as well. So I,
Right.
I think it'd be interesting to see if you could dial those things up and actually, positively bias certain groups. But
Right. Exactly.
these systems aren't necessarily built for that, or like set up
Yeah.
to incorporate that, or
Yeah.
have been tested in that way. So it's I think it's almost I'm trying to be like positive for a negative situation, but if we were thinking more from the other direction and going, oh, actually, like, can we help these people in some positive way? And it might not be like this hiring process, but it could be part of some process that we are trying to incorporate some systems to help our situation and different people, and to promote. I always think of it as the idea of ethics is finding and promoting the good life, and
Right.
curating our future. So, what is the world that we want to be living in? And it's definitely not like discriminating against large groups because they happen to be bad at presenting themselves over Zoom. You know what I mean? That's
Right.
like that's just like not the
Yeah.
world
Yeah.
that I'm gunning for anyway. Um,
Yeah.
you mentioned you had a couple, like lots of of options that you wanted to talk through.
Mhm.
I think we've probably got another time for another one, if that was
Mhm.
okay. If you still had one in you.
I think one thing that I also want to talk about is risk assessment in the case of social services. So currently, and this is happening quite a lot in the UK, there are algorithms which are being used to try and identify a need of social services. And what this, I think, just to kind of give a broad description of essentially what a risk assessment is. So certain standards are placed against a certain weight. And so based off of the combined weight of those standards, you can either be at considered to be at greater risk of, for example, domestic violence, sexual violence, antisocial behavior, or you can also be not at risk of those things. So what happens with these algorithms, especially in a lot of British local authorities, is that the specific one I'm thinking of is Zantura, which develops a predictive model for children's antisocial behavior. And so it takes certain models, so school attendance, whether or not there's police records involved, and it takes that to indicate whether or not the child is going to be at risk of any particular kind of violence, but also to determine their need of social services. And I think that this is tricky for two reasons, and and this is why I want to talk about it. One, this algorithm objectively is supposed to do a good thing. It is supposed to be kind of an additional net because maybe social security services cannot be as attentive to correlations and linkages between school absences and domestic violence. And on the other hand, it's also supposed to make these processes give more attention to children in need. However, because of the design, I think, of society in and of itself, and because of the design of some of these incidences, violence does not always present in one way. And so you can have a model which is helping a certain group and then determining that another group is not in need of help because it doesn't fit those metrics, even though you can still consider violence as something that is, you can consider it as economic, it can be verbal, it can be mental, it can be psychological. And so in a sense, to really consider the fact that the weighting metrics are, they tend to be things that are pronounced and obvious. So something as simple as a police record. And yet we know there are so many instances where incidents are not reported to the police or cannot be reported to the police. And so it causes this catch 22 where you can't catch everybody, but you're also filtering out a lot of people from the system. And since you give the children who have a higher risk score more attention in terms of social services, it also means that then you say, well, these ones must not be in as dire need because they don't present this way. And it's dangerous. It's a dangerous ecosystem, and this also tends to happen in the sense of it will attract attention to certain locations and certain geographic fences than it will some other areas. There tends to be an over criminalization or over datafication of the indigent. They tend to be concentrated among certain socioeconomic demographics, and these are also correlating with racial demographics and gender-based demographics. And so you end up creating a problem within a problem that is really supposed to be a solution. And part of figuring out what it is that we need in society to help us is also being able to untangle the complicated histories of what presents to us and what is the case underneath. And so I wanted to bring this up because I think we also need to kind of be able to hold in our minds the complexity of competing interests and also the complexity of competing outcomes. And a social impact can, by, for all intents and purposes, be positive, but then it can also be creating a much greater danger underneath it.
I mean, I think we could really dig into that one. I think one of there's a couple of things which spring to mind when you were talking, and it really, like you're saying, it really depends on what you're measuring, essentially. So
Right.
if you're measuring one thing over another thing, then you're enforcing that as the thing that we care about, right, in society.
Right.
Um, and
Right.
and even if we care about it now, like it might be dogmatic in the future. We might need to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that that evolves, right, with the changing of our situations and
Right.
movements of people. Like there's all sorts of things that change, right, and these systems don't necessarily change, or the data needs to be updated, and what we measure might need to change with those peoples, right, so that we don't
Right.
get into, like you're saying, this problem within a problem, like this kind of loop cycle. But also it is annoying because it's like you want to do good, you want to be like,
Yeah.
we've created this thing. It is we've like, in the ideal world, obviously we're not cutting all of
Mm-hmm.
this other stuff in place of this thing.
Right.
This is an extra thing, and maybe it'll catch people that slip through the net.
Right.
And that's, on the surface, seems like totally awesome and positive. And I
Right.
guess what you're saying is that even if that is the case, you could also have some of these issues that are attached to that. Um, Even if you're trying to do the best you can in that situation, there's
Right.
other considerations. So, what is it that etiques and what you guys are producing with OASI? What is like
Mm-hmm.
the end game? What's like the hope for this process, and what you're trying to leverage and provide?
I think one thing is that we really do want to talk about how AI can be a tool by and for society. And we want to use this in the sense of just creating a hybrid methodology that's sort of socio-technical to be able to audit some of these algorithms, to be able to just look back and think not just about, code-based design principles, but also to think about the environment that they're affecting, and to be able to involve a large pool of stakeholders in the decisions that ultimately get made about people's day-to-day lives. A big part of Ethicus's mission is to create this very real, very positive social impact, and to say, well, they can exist, but they can only exist at the helm of a lot of regulation and at the helm of a lot of accountability. And we want to be a vehicle for accountability. We want to be a vehicle for visibility and transparency. And ultimately, we want to be able to create a lot of these systems or a lot of these processes that can make sure that these systems don't continue on to become completely harmful.
Well, I think it's really fascinating. I know that when you guys contacted me and we had a chat, it was great to see that you were obviously all really impassioned by this work. I'm hoping that people can see like the importance of just bringing to light some of these things that aren't always transparent, that we're kind of beholden to, especially going forward. Especially as we get further into all this stuff,
Yeah.
and people like me apply datafication in places.
Mm-hmm.
What excites you in this area, using technology and AI and machine learning, and what really scares you about this area in the future?
I would say what excites me is the this sort of development of possibility. I think that one thing is that there are a lot of great options in terms of how you can use AI to make processes more apparent, and also I think what it can say about what we think about society, depending on how we can peel back the layer of these processes, how things are made, how things are implemented. I think I'm excited to maximize the sort of human algorithmic interaction. And I would like to see not a separation of, a so-called objective algorithm and human subjective intervention, but really a strong merging of the two, to realize one doesn't exist without the other. And in fact, one is more dependent on the other. And I think that because of the directions that are being taken, especially in terms of regulation, we have the EU AI Act that we, currently right now is doing the rounds, and we hope it will become actual law. And because of that, we can actually create a society that is beneficial. And we can do that hand in hand with technology. And we can also realize what technology's purpose is. But for as long as we remain the ultimate arbitrators, or arbiters rather,
Yeah.
I think what I'm terrified of is something I read recently, which referred to the algorithmization of society. I think that's what I'm completely terrified of. If you think about what you see on something as simple as your social media feed, what you see, the decisions that are being made about you. If you go into a hospital and your data is being fed into several algorithms to decide what level of care should you be given, what's going to happen to you post the care that you're going to be given, whether or not on the basis of certain characteristics you deserve a certain amount of attention. And then you come out of there, the place, the house that you're meant to live in, you're subject to an algorithm which sifts through your history and determines that if you as a renter would be an appropriate fit for the landlord. If you go to school and the algorithm determines where you're going to go to school, where your grades tell you you should end up. I think that there is a real fear of being subject to these imperfect technologies, which are then making critical decisions about day to day life. And I am terrified for a day where, if you consider, from the point of birth, a child just being subject to an algorithmic process at every stage of their life. I think for me, that's what I'm very, very afraid of.
I think I feel like I'm going to make a pithy comment about that, but I feel like similarly, like I'm in the same boat as you here. With it sounds pretty horrific. We want to utilize our autonomy, our free will. Hopefully, people
Right.
believe in that. We want to change our circumstances, and these dogmatic systems or systems everywhere are not going to necessarily enable that, presumably, or maybe not in their current form.
Right.
So I think we've come to the end. It was really good to have you on. Thank you, Mitchel. How do people find out about you and etiques and follow you and all that sort of thing?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I really loved this conversation. You can find Etiques at www.etiques.tech, and you can find me at, it's a particular spelling of the name Michelle. Just think of it as the boy spelling. You can find me on LinkedIn, and yeah. So I think that's primarily where we're at. You can also find Etiques on LinkedIn and on Twitter. And hopefully we get to kind of continue this conversation and we can create a real change.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Hi, and welcome to the end of the podcast. Thanks again to Michel for coming on the podcast. I think it's really interesting what they're doing with the OASI register. It seems like one of those things which almost could be taken control of by the European Union or some governments, and kind of doing some of this work, collating some of this stuff for us, really. So I thought that was interesting that they're doing that work, and maybe it's one of those things that gets spun out into other organisations in future. We'll see. Also be interested to dig deeper into the kinds of things that are submitted to them from services, private sector, that sort of thing. And again, the amount of transparency there is really interesting to me too. Again, if you like this episode and like to find more, you can go to the machine-ethics.net website. And if you can support us at patreon.com/machinethics. We'll be back very soon with our end of year episode at the beginning of January, so we'll see you then.